Hey everyone, Mark here. Today I'm going to be covering how to fly the Blacksquare mod for the default King Air that comes in Microsoft Flight Simulator. Today's video is going to cover how to fly the airplane in VFR conditions. I'm going to cover engine management, avionics configurations, what all the different important gauges are for, a couple of autopilot modes, and a few other little details along the way as well. I'm already planning a follow-up video where I'm going to explain how to fly this airplane in IFR conditions, so if you have any questions or things you would like clarified on the different systems of the airplane, make sure to put it in the comments and I'll try and address it there. Alright, there is a ton to cover today, so let's get going. I'm going to start from the beginning and we're going to look at how to bring the airplane to life. Blacksquare have updated the integrated checklists that come with the airplane to have all of the different details that you need to know about on how to start the engine and all the different procedures that you have to use. Personally, I don't really like using these checklists because I find they get in the way when you've got a single screen. But I do use them when I'm first learning the airplane just to figure out where all of the switches are, and once I'm used to that, I'll usually create my own custom checklists. I've created one for this airplane and I'll actually have a link to it in the show notes to download it on flightsim.to, where I basically outline all of the necessary steps to bring the airplane to life and how to get to every different phase of flight. The first thing I do once I am in the cockpit is I make sure that everything is set up properly on my controls as well as in the cockpit. So I'm going to make sure that my parking brake is on, my throttle is at idle, my prop is full forward, and my condition levers are at the cutoff position. Normally at this point what I do is turn the battery on and turn the avionics master on and program in my flight plan into the GPS, and I am going to do that. But before that, what I want to do is just cover all the different avionics configurations that you can have with this airplane. On the co-pilot side, there are two switches that you can use to manipulate the navigation stacks. The leftmost option on the first switch gives you a standard nav radio stack that you can use for navigating by VOR, but not much else. The second position gives you a GNS 530 GPS, and the last option gives you a fancier GTN 750 GPS. If you want the GTN 750, you're going to have to purchase and install it yourself because it's an add-on to the airplane rather than being part of it. So for that reason, I really recommend just going with the GNS 530 and installing the working title mod for it that's available in the in-game marketplace, which is going to improve a ton of features around it. The second switch allows you to go between a regular navigation stack and the GPS. You're not really meant to have two GPSs side by side. That's really there if you want to say have your primary navigation be the nav radios and have your GPS be your secondary, so you could easily set that up with setting those different switches in different places. The other thing to be aware of is on the weather radar panel, there are a few different settings that you can change for the airplane. If you scroll over to the log page, what you can do is configure the failures for the airplane. Personally, when you're just getting started, I recommend just putting this to no failures, getting used to flying the airplane, and then once you are, you can turn failures back on and maybe even configure some custom failures if you want to practice stuff. But for now, I would really just leave this off. If you go down to the nav page, the next thing that you can do is actually repair the engines as well as refill oxygen and reset any failures that occurred during your last flight. This plane does remember its condition from flight to flight, so if you damage the engines as you're flying around, you're going to see that percentage that's at 100% right now continue to drop down, and you can just come here to repair them really easily. I'm doing a VFR flight today, but I've loaded in a flight plan into the GPS anyways, just because this plane is really fast and you can get off track really quickly. Back on the main panel, I'm going to set my cruise altitude into the autopilot. By default, the dial increments in thousands of feet, but if you want to set it to hundreds of feet, all you do is just click on it, and the next time you turn it, it's going to increment in batches of 100. After that, I'm going to set the altimeter to the local pressure, and if you prefer to use inches of mercury or millibars, all you've got to do is press on the little button right next to the altimeter and it'll switch back and forth between the two modes. In terms of navigation, the GPS is telling me that I need to be flying on a track of 328 once I'm airborne, so I'm going to twist the course knob that's right under the HSI to set that manually. And the last thing, I'm going to change the nav source to use the GPS instead so that the HSI is updating from the right place. And with all of that done, I'm going to turn the avionics master back off and I'm going to go through the engine start procedure. The flow for starting the engine is actually pretty simple once you get used to it. And we're going to start with the right engine because that's the one that's closest to the battery. So I'm going to flip the right ignition and engine start to on. And in a couple of seconds, if we look over, we're going to see the engine start spooling up. This is actually the first way that you can damage the engine, and is by doing something called a hot start. That could happen if you had the condition lever in low or high idle and you hit the starter. What would happen is the ITT temperature, which is the turbine temperature, would exceed what it normally should for engine start and would actually cause damage to the engine. So to avoid that, all I do is wait for all the numbers to settle down, and once they have, I move the condition lever to low idle, and then you're going to see that the ITT is going to start coming up really quick, as well as the turbine RPM. Once the turbine RPM goes past 50, that's where I'm going to turn the ignition back to off, and I'm going to wait for everything to stabilize again. And at that point, all I have to do is turn the right generator on, and the right engine start is complete. To start the left engine, what you're actually going to start by doing is putting the right engine into high idle, which is going to help it start the left-hand side engine. The rest of the procedure is exactly the same as what I did for the right engine, so I'm just going to skim through it. I'll turn the ignition on first, wait for it to start spooling up, and then I'm going to add fuel, wait a couple more seconds and turn the ignition off, turn the generator on, and finally bring the right engine back to low idle. The only thing left to do now that both engines are running is to bring the inverters online so that we take our DC power and turn it into AC power. And I'm also going to turn on the avionics master at this point too and let it boot up again. And finally, I'm going to go to the right side of the cockpit to set the bleed air to environmental off. And once I've done that, you should see that all of the different messages on the annunciator panel at the top have now gone off. So there's no red lights, so we are good to fly. And in the bottom panel, we've got a couple of warning lights up, and we'll handle a couple of those right now before we get taxiing. Those things are all the way at the bottom of the cockpit, so you have to turn the rudder boost on, the electric trim on, and finally you have to rotate the dial to set it to what your cruise altitude is going to be so that the plane pressurizes properly as you continue to climb up. I'm not too worried about it today because I'm only going up to about 6,500 feet, but on a flight where I was going to be going much higher, I would definitely make sure to set it properly. Okay, and with all of that said, I'm finally ready to taxi. While I've got a few seconds here, I do want to remind you, if you get some value from this video, to please make sure to hit the like button and think about subscribing as well. I publish a new video every 2 weeks with tips, tricks, and tutorials for Microsoft Flight Simulator, and your likes and subscribes are what keep the channel growing. I stopped just short of the runway, and before takeoff, I'm going to set the auto feather to the arm position so that if I lose an engine on takeoff, that it feathers the prop automatically for me, and that's going to make it a whole lot easier to fly the airplane. And I'm also going to turn the auto ignition to on as well. There are a few more details that I could do to make my flight a little bit more realistic, but the essentials is what I've just shown you now, and everything else is detailed in the checklist anyways. The King Air is one of those rare airplanes that doesn't need any flaps at all on takeoff, so all I've got to do at this point is very progressively apply power until I get to 100% on the torque. Try and avoid just slamming the throttle all the way to full, because what's going to happen if you do that is the prop is actually going to bounce off of its limiter, which can over time cause wear and tear to the engine. I'm not sure if this is actually simulated, but it's a bad practice to have anyways. The main thing to avoid though, to avoid engine damage, is to make sure that as you're applying throttle that you don't go past the torque limit or the ITT limit as well. Either one will cause damage to the engine. At 105 knots, I'm going to gently pull back on the stick and I'll go up to about 10 degrees, and once I've got a climb rate, I'll just bring the gear up. One trick that I heard, if you find that things are happening really quickly with the airplane, is to actually just dial the power back by about 10 to 15% on takeoff and in every other phase of flight as well. It's going to make everything happen a little bit slower, and it does help to be able to get used to the speed of this airplane. At this point, I am well into my climb, so I'm going to reduce power a little bit, and then I'm going to bring the prop back to 1600 RPM for the rest of the flight. Make sure that you drop power first and then adjust the prop. If you do it the other way around, you're risking an over torque situation, because dropping the prop actually increases torque, and that could again potentially cause damage to your engine. And while I'm still hand flying the airplane here, I'm just going to add in a notch of right aileron, because for some reason the plane rolls left with my configuration. I'm not sure if this is normal or not. The ideal profile for climb in this airplane is around 180 knots and 2,700 feet per minute, but I sometimes use a little bit less than that just to get a little bit better visibility. I've skipped forward a little bit, and at this point I'm going to go down to the autopilot panel and I'm going to turn the autopilot master on so that once I get to my cruise altitude that the plane's automatically going to level off for me. The King Air can easily cruise in the high thousands and low 20,000s if it wants to, but in this flight I'm going to stay somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 feet just because I'm flying VFR and I want to be able to make out the landmarks to see where I'm going. I've got heading mode on right now on the autopilot, and you can see the little heading bug in the HSI is that little white bar that's right at the top. I'm going to switch into nav mode at this point so that the airplane automatically intercepts my course for me. I could do this with heading mode if I really wanted to as well though, but nav mode will do it perfectly fine. Now that I'm at cruise, I'm going to take just a couple minutes to go over some of the major differences in the gauges that you should know about for VFR flying. Let's start with the airspeed indicator. The red and blue lines are something that only appear on multi-engine airplanes. The red line is the minimum controllable airspeed, and the blue line is the single engine climb speed. Realistically, what that means, if you're flying around with failures on and you have an engine that dies, you're going to want to try and pitch the airplane to stay at or above the blue line. You can fly the airplane at or above the red line as well, but you won't be able to climb out at that speed, so if you have to go around when you're coming into land, you're going to be pretty much screwed. There's a little white arrow just above the 220 knots mark. That's supposed to be the speed at which you can go to approach flaps, but according to the pilot's operating handbook as well as the overhead panel in the airplane, that's actually supposed to be 202 knots. So I'm not quite sure what's going on there, and I still use 202 as my speed at which I can extend my flaps to approach. You'll notice there's a white arc that goes from 80 knots all the way up to about 158 knots, and that indicates the speed at which you can go to full flaps when you're coming into land. And lastly, you've got the red and white needle, which is right near the top of the airspeed indicator, which indicates the speed that you should never exceed. Moving on to the attitude indicator, and the only thing I really want to point out here for now is the radar altimeter, which is in the top right, which is telling you your height above the ground. And on the HSI, the only two bits of information you really need to know for now are in the top left, which is your distance to your next waypoint in your flight plan or whatever VOR you're tracking. And on the right-hand side, you have the time it's going to take you to get to that waypoint in minutes. There are a bunch of little labels that can appear in both the attitude indicator and the HSI, and there's a bunch of other little details I skipped over, but I'm going to cover those when I do the instrument flying video because they're all related to instrument landing modes. Because this plane is so fast, you're going to want to make a very rough calculation on when you should start to descend, and I'll include a link in the show notes to a video where I explain just how to do that. In terms of what autopilot mode you should use when you are ready to descend, there's a couple of options that you can choose from. IAS is like flight level change mode in the G1000. It's going to adjust your descent rate to match the airspeed that you tell it to, so if you pull the power all the way back, you'll be able to get a pretty steep descent rate. For VFR flights though, I prefer to use vertical speed mode because it gives me a little bit more control over the descent rate, and it allows me to bleed off airspeed as I'm descending so that once I get to traffic pattern altitude, I'm at my maneuvering airspeed. That's as easy as pressing the VS button on the autopilot and then pressing the nose down arrow to increase your descent rate. Each press of the button is 100 feet, but if you've lost track of how often you've pressed it, just look at the vertical speed gauge and you'll be able to tell immediately. I'll usually use around 1500 feet for my descent, and it works well with the power set around 30%, although I adjust that depending on the weather conditions, and it brings me slowly down to flaps extension speed at 202 knots. The last autopilot option for descent is the DSC mode, which is going to let the plane manage your airspeed as well as your descent rate according to its own profile. I personally find this mode to be a little bit too aggressive, and I'll only use it in situations where I realize that I've fallen behind on my descent. Now that I'm approaching the airport, I've already got the flaps at approach because I'm below 200 knots, and once I get to 180, that's when I'm going to bring the landing gear down so that one, I don't forget about it, but it's also going to increase the amount of drag and help to slow the airplane down a whole lot more. My goal is to be at around 160 knots as I enter the downwind leg, and I'm going to continue decelerating from there with my ultimate goal of being at around 120 knots when I'm turning from base to final. I give myself a lot of extra space with this airplane because I am definitely not a pro at flying it yet. And if you try and fly a very tight circuit with it, I find it to be very challenging with all of that extra speed that you're carrying around. But the other really big problem with this airplane when you're coming into land is the visibility. Those giant pillars that are on either side of the airplane, as well as the one right down the middle of the cockpit, are going to obstruct your view of the airport, and it's going to be really hard to judge where you are relative to the runway. Make sure that you have keys that are properly assigned not only to look left and right, but to also lean forward and back so that you can look around the pillars and get a visual on the runway. Otherwise, you're going to end up completely missing your base to final turn. For that reason, I tend to fly with heading mode on the autopilot until I'm established on final. It just makes everything a little bit easier, and I can focus on keeping an eye on where the airport is and not have to worry about flying the airplane as much. And ideally, for your first few landings, try and give yourself a couple extra nautical miles on final when you're in the traffic pattern, just so that if you screw something up, you have a little bit of time to adjust. Once you're established on final though, you're going to want to go to full flaps, and at that point you'll need to dial in a bunch of nose up trim to relieve some of the pressure from the controls. If you find that you're either too high or too low at this point, only make a small power change. It's really easy to overcompensate with these engines because they are very powerful, and you'll end up in the opposite situation before you know it. I've seen differing thoughts on this, but I bring the prop RPM back to almost full at this point as well. Like that, if I make a mistake and I have to go around, I'm already configured for it, but I've also seen a lot of people say to only go to full prop once you've actually touched down, so it's really up to you. I try and maintain around 120 to 125 knots on short final so that I have a little bit of wiggle room above landing speed. And this is especially important on days when there's a lot of wind and it can sort of push the airplane speed around. I try to be at around 105 knots as I'm going by the threshold, but I only pull the power all the way back once I'm a few feet over the runway, because I find if I do it any earlier than that the plane just has a tendency to just drop to the ground. You barely need to flare at all for the exact same reason. Just pull the power back over the runway and it should settle down on its main gear quite nicely. Once you're down, you can bring the power into reverse as well as bring the flaps up if you want to reduce your landing distance, but on an average runway length, you're not going to really have to worry about it all too much. Just use a little bit of reverse power and just lightly use the brakes to get down to taxiing speed. Hopefully you learned a few tricks for this airplane along the way, and although I'm wrapping up here for today, I will be doing a follow-up with regards to flying this airplane in instrument conditions, so you can look for that in the coming weeks. In the meantime, if you got some value from this video, please make sure to hit the like button and consider subscribing as well to get more similar content.